Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video we're going to talk about output gaps. So if you recall in the last video when we talked about the business cycle, we said, okay, we want to be on that black ascending line, full employment, growing the economy over time in the long run. But we know as we're doing that there's going to be short run fluctuations in the economy, and that's where you see this red squiggly line here, right? Peaks and troughs as the economy goes above or below the line. And we're trying to smooth out those gaps so that the red line is as close to the black ascending line as possible. In this video, what I want to do is model those gaps, positive output gaps and negative output gaps, using the aggregate supply and demand model we developed in the last unit. So let's go ahead and do that by starting with negative output gaps. These are also called recessionary gaps because they model recessions or contractions in the economy, and it's when the economy is below full employment, below the black ascending line on the business cycle. And when you are in a recession or a recessionary gap or a negative output gap, a lot of names for the same thing, you have lower GDP, okay? You have higher unemployment and you have a lower price level, so deflation or less inflation, okay? So the economy is sluggish, it's slowing down, right? If you want to think about it like a car, it's a car that's putting on the brakes and the economy is not moving as fast as we need it to be at that black ascending line on the business cycle chart. And so how can we model this situation where the economy is in a recession? And I want to emphasize to you that both negative and positive output gaps are not a quote-unquote good thing for an economy. We don't want short-run gaps. We want long-run growth, okay? So let's go ahead and graph the economy in a recessionary gap. And this is a very important skill because many APFRQ questions will often start you in a recessionary gap. So with drawing aggregate supply and demand, the labels aren't going to change. We have Y and PL for real GDP and price level. And then what we're going to do here is there's basically two different ways you could draw this. You could start it in long run and then move it into the gap, or you could just start it with the gap. And I'm going to show it to you with the gap. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to draw long run aggregate supply. Okay, so we're going to do this in a little bit different order than I normally do it. And then I'm going to bring in aggregate demand, just like that. And then I'm going to bring in short run aggregate supply. And what you're going to see here is that we are not in long run equilibrium. How do we know this? Because short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand do not intersect long run aggregate supply at the same point. And so because our short run equilibrium is to the left of the long run equilibrium, that's how we know we are in a recessionary gap. So I'll use blue here to kind of illustrate this. So YF is full employment. That's the black ascending line. That's where we want to be, right? But where we are right now, sorry about that, is right here at Y1, okay? So this is the recessionary gap. This is the negative output gap. Okay, so the economy is producing a GDP that is less than full employment output. We have a higher unemployment rate than the natural rate, and yes, we have less inflation than we would at full employment. And so we can go ahead and put our price level here at PL1. And so this is where the economy is if it's in a recessionary gap, right? So if you want kind of a way to just kind of remember this, it's when AD and SRAS, their intersection point is to the left of the long run aggregate supply curve. That's how you can kind of remember it. But I think what's important, especially if you want a 5 on the AP exams or even a 4, it's important to understand why this is a recessionary gap. Why is this how we draw it? Because a recessionary gap means an output level that's below or less than full employment. And that's exactly what we drew here. Y1, our current output level, is below full employment output. So this is a recessionary gap. I would encourage you to practice drawing it like this. Another way that sometimes it gets drawn is you start off in long run equilibrium. So like this, we'll call this AD naught. And then AD moves to the left, and then that's what forms the recessionary gap. So recessionary gaps occur when aggregate demand shifts to the left, and so we have an output level and a price level that decrease, okay? And which means rising unemployment. So there's two ways AP could have you create a recessionary gap. They could start you in long run and then move AD to the left, or they could say, hey, just start it off in the gap. Just start it with AD, SRAS, that intersection point to the left of long run aggregate supply. There are multiple ways for you to draw it. Sorry, I just need to take a drink there. So that's how we would draw a recessionary gap. Of course, there is more than just recessionary gaps. There are also positive or inflationary gaps. This is when the economy is above full employment with higher GDP, okay, lower unemployment, and a higher price level. In terms of the car analogy, this is the economy moving too fast. Yes, we have higher output. Yes, we have lower unemployment, but prices are rising, and we don't want prices to get out of control. And so this is called an expansion or a recovery. We're coming out of a recession. The economy is expanding, but it's not a sustainable expansion. Remember, we want long-run growth, not short-run fluctuations. And so positive output gaps, despite the name, are nowhere near as good as long-run economic growth. So with that in mind, how do we draw a positive output gap? And I'm sure you can kind of guess and see where I'm going here because it's going to be just the opposite of a recessionary gap. So once again, Y and PL. And then we'll start with long-run aggregate supply. And then I'm going to bring in aggregate demand. And then I'm going to make the intersection point to the left, to the right of long-run aggregate supply. And so we have, we'll do green this time. So we have YF, so that's full employment output, but we can see that our current output level, Y1, at the short-run equilibrium, is greater than YF. And then, of course, we've got our price level chilling out over here at PL1. And so what we can see here is that we have a positive output gap. Output is greater than full employment output in the short run. We're going to have a higher price level than we would at long-run equilibrium. And so inflation is the concern here. With inflationary gaps or positive output gaps, inflation is the concern. With recessionary or negative output gaps, it is unemployment that is the main concern. So it's important we understand how can we draw these gaps. One way is to just go ahead and draw the gap, put it there already. Another way, just like we did before, is we could say, okay, we're going to start at long run. We'll call this AD naught. And then inflationary gaps occur when AD moves to the right. So everything with these gaps and with stabilization policy, which I'm going to define for you in just a second, is all about aggregate demand, right? It's all about aggregate demand isn't where it should be. It's either moved to the right, inflation, or it's moved to the left, unemployment. And how can we flip that arrow and move aggregate demand back to where it was at long run? Because again, if we want to move a curve, the curve we're trying to really move is long run aggregate supply. We want sustainable economic growth, not short run fluctuations. And I think that's where students sometimes struggle a little bit because they're like, well, why wouldn't you want a positive output gap? Why wouldn't you want higher output? Because we don't want the inflation that comes with it, right? Because when you increase LRAS, you get higher output, you get lower unemployment, and you don't get really any change in inflation. And so that's why LRAS is the best way to achieve sustainable growth. So Those are the gaps, negative output gaps and positive output gaps, those short-run fluctuations around full employment. And so the goal of macroeconomics is what we would call, and I'm going to go ahead and write this out because I forgot to type it for you. It's called stabilization policy. So what we're looking at, these are policies, right? Policies designed to eliminate output gaps. So what we're trying to do is eliminate positive and negative output gaps and restore the economy to full employment. And we do this by changing aggregate demand, right? This is the mechanism by which we do this because it's a change in aggregate demand that creates output gaps. And so the opposite change will move us back to full employment. So what I encourage you to do at this point in the unit and at this point in the course, practice drawing those output gaps. Practice drawing recessionary gaps and inflationary gaps because that is an incredibly important skill, in particular for the free response section of the AP Macroeconomics exam. So that's all for this video on output gaps. Until next time, have a great day.